Albuquerque is the biggest city in New Mexico, a desert Sunbelt town where, strangely, the rain falls on the wrong side of the mountains. In almost every mountain city in America, the wet slope faces the storms and the dry slope hides in the shadow behind them. Albuquerque runs the pattern in reverse. The city sits on the parched side while the rain climbs up and over to the back. But here's the thing, that backwards weather is the least strange thing about this place, because the ground underneath the city is doing something even stranger than the sky above it. Albuquerque sits inside a crack in the continent, a tear in the crust of North America that is, very slowly, pulling itself apart. The mountains next to the city are rising, the floor the city is built on is sinking, and almost everything about how this place was born, grew, and governed itself runs opposite to every other city in America. Most cities are built where the land invites them. Albuquerque was built where the land is coming undone. Once you see how, you can't unsee it. Start with the sky, because the sky gives the whole game away. In a normal mountain city, moist air rolls in, slams into the peaks, and dumps its rain and snow on the slope facing the wind. The other side, the sheltered side, stays dry. Geographers call that a rain shadow, and it's one of the most reliable patterns in all of geography. Albuquerque breaks it. The Sandia and Manzano Mountains rise on the eastern edge of the city, and the wettest ground isn't the city side at all. It's the far eastern slopes and the high peaks which can pull in somewhere around 30 inches of moisture a year, much of it as snow. Down in the city, on the western foot of those same mountains, the total collapses to roughly 9 inches. 9 inches. That's less than parts of the Sahara receive in a good year, sitting right in the shadow of slopes that get more than triple the amount. And to really feel how backwards this is, drive 50 miles north to Santa Fe. Higher up, cooler, greener, wetter. A completely different climate a short hop up the road. Albuquerque is the low, dry, hot one, even though on a simple map they look like neighbors sharing the same mountains. So before we've even left the weather report, the thesis is already proving itself. This is a city where the obvious rule of the landscape gets flipped on its head. And the sky is the gentle version, because the real inversion is buried 3 miles beneath the streets. Stand on the Sandia crest, 10,000 feet above the city, and put your hand on the granite. That rock is roughly 1.5 billion years old, some of the oldest stone in North America. Now here's the part that should stop you cold. That exact same layer of ancient granite also exists directly beneath the city, but down there it lies buried around 3 miles below the surface. Think about what that means. The same rock is at the top of the mountain and 3 miles under the parking lots in the same small patch of the planet. The crust here didn't simply push a mountain up. It cracked and one side rose while the other side dropped like a trapdoor. Albuquerque is sitting on the side that dropped. That trapdoor has a name. It's called the Rio Grande Rift, a 450-mile-long tear running down through New Mexico where the continent is literally stretching and thinning, splitting apart a fraction of an inch at a time. This isn't ancient history frozen in place. The rift is still active, and it has surrounded the city with a strange collection of landforms all at once. Jagged mountains on one side, flat-top mesas on another, open plains, deep canyons, and off to the west, a line of young volcanoes whose black lava still caps the cliffs above town. Most cities pick the safest, flattest, most stable ground they can find and settle in for the long haul. Albuquerque was built inside a slow-motion geological wound. And here's the twist that makes the whole story work. This unstable, collapsing, half-torn piece of ground is exactly where not one civilization, but 3 decided to build. Here's a question that sounds simple and isn't. When was Albuquerque founded? Ask the city and it will tell you 1706, but that answer hides something. Long before any Europeans set foot here, Pueblo peoples were living. Along this stretch of the Rio Grande, not passing through, but settled, farming the floodplain, building villages, generation after generation, for centuries. When Spanish explorers first pushed into the region in 1540, they didn't discover empty land. They arrived in a place that was already home. Then, in 1706, Spanish colonists formally founded a town on the river and named it after a duke back in Spain. And somewhere along the way, the city quietly dropped a letter from that original Spanish name and became the Albuquerque we know. Later still, after the United States took the territory, the Americans arrived and layered their own city on top of everything that came before. So this is a place with three separate beginnings stacked on the same ground: Pueblo, Spanish, and American, where most US cities have exactly one clean origin story from a single frontier moment. And that raises a genuine puzzle worth chewing on. If people were living here continuously for centuries before the town dated itself to 1706, then when was Albuquerque really born? I'd love to hear where you land on that in the comments. There's no clean answer, and that's exactly what makes it interesting. Hold on to that idea of a city that keeps starting over, because it was about to start over again, and this time it would walk away from its own birthplace. In 1880, a decision made in a railroad office rearranged the entire city. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad was laying track across New Mexico, and when it reached Albuquerque, it did something that looks almost spiteful. It put the tracks 2 miles east of the old Spanish Plaza, the historic heart of the town, the place with the church and the square and nearly 2 centuries of history. 2 miles doesn't sound like much. But in the age of the railroad, 2 miles was everything. The tracks were where the money moved, where goods came in and shipped out, where the future was going to happen. So a brand new settlement sprang up right beside the rails, and people started calling it Newtown. Businesses, hotels, warehouses, and homes clustered around the depot. In the original plaza, the actual birthplace of the city got left behind almost overnight. That old plaza is still there today. We call it Old Town, and it survives as a beautifully preserved relic, full of low adobe walls, a centuries-old church, tourists wandering the shaded square, and the slow quiet of a place that history moved on from. But it's a preserved relic precisely because the living city got up and moved 2 miles east to be near the train. Picture the strangeness of it. The original heart of the town left standing almost intact, while the real energy, the jobs, the commerce, and the crowds all drained toward the depot down the road. Think about that. This is a city that walked away from the spot where it was born and rebuilt itself around a set of railroad tracks, leaving its own cradle behind as a museum. That was Reinvention number 2. Pueblo ground, then a Spanish plaza, then a railroad town that abandoned the plaza. You'd think a city could only reinvent itself so many times. But the third reinvention was the strangest of all, and it arrived in the form of a bomb. In 1945, the most secret project in American history reached out and grabbed this sleepy railroad and farming town. As the Manhattan Project raced to build the atomic bomb, a piece of that effort, a group known as Z Division, was set up on the eastern edge of Albuquerque. That site would grow into Kirtland Air Force Base and Sandia National Laboratories, and it would completely rewrite what this city was for. Understand the before and after here. Before the war, Albuquerque's economy ran on the things you'd expect from a southwestern town: farming along the river, the railroad, small trade. Then, almost overnight, it became a center of Cold War nuclear engineering, packed with physicists and military officers and classified research. Sandia grew so fast and so important that by 1949 it split off into its own fully independent operation. A desert town became a national security hub in a handful of years. And here's the part that makes Albuquerque different from almost every other American boomtown. Cities usually grow because of organic demand. A port that ships more goods, factories that hire more workers, industries that pull people in on their own momentum. Albuquerque's explosion didn't come from any of that. It came from federal money, military and scientific dollars, dropped onto the desert by decisions made in Washington. The growth wasn't earned by the local economy. It was imposed on it from the outside. And when a city's rise is handed to it rather than built by it, you get strange results. Including this one. Albuquerque became huge, while never becoming the place that actually runs the state. Here's a rule so consistent across America that you probably never noticed it was a rule. The biggest city in a region is usually its center of power, its capital, or at least its cultural and economic heart. Think New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Denver. Big city, big gravity, calling the shots. Albuquerque is the glaring exception. It is by far the largest city in New Mexico, the population anchor, the economic engine, the place most people picture when they think of the state. And it holds none of the political power. The capital is Santa Fe, 60 miles up the road, a much smaller city that has held the seat of government since Spanish colonial times, long before Albuquerque's railroad boom or its nuclear refounding. So the state's biggest city and its capital are two different places, and the big one bows to the small one. That's the direct fingerprint of everything we've just seen. Because Albuquerque's size was imposed by outside money in the 20th century, it never grew up as the seat of power. Santa Fe already had that role locked in from centuries earlier. Albuquerque got the people and the growth. Santa Fe kept the crown. And that inversion, big city, no power, turns out to be a small preview. Because the same backwards logic that shaped the city was about to play out on a much bigger stage, the entire state around it. New Mexico holds a record that almost nobody knows about, and it is not a happy one. Before it became a state in 1912, it spent 62 years as a U.S. territory. 62 years. That is the longest wait for statehood in the entire history of the country. To feel how absurd that is, line it up against its neighbors. Colorado waited about 15 years before it was let in. Wyoming waited around 22. New Mexico waited 62, roughly 3 times as long as the states right next door. It took more than 4 dozen separate bills in Congress, attempt after attempt, decade after decade, all failing to get the territory across the line. And behind that number are real human lives. An entire generation was born, grew up, and grew old inside a territory that never became a full state. Imagine spending your whole life, childhood to old age, as a kind of second-class American, watching the country make decisions that ruled your world while you had no real say in them. That meant living for decades without full representation, without a vote in presidential elections, without the basic rights of citizenship that Americans just across the state line simply had by default. And this wasn't a tiny frontier outpost of a few hundred settlers. This population was largely Hispanic and Native American, people who had been rooted on this land far longer than most of the country had existed, waiting outside the door while newer, smaller, less established territories were waved in ahead of them, one after another. Which forces the obvious question, why? Why did this one territory get made to wait 3 times longer than anyone else? And this is where the story stops being quirky and gets genuinely uncomfortable. The uncomfortable part is that New Mexico wasn't kept waiting because it wasn't ready. By the numbers, it often was more than ready. At various points, it had more people and a bigger economy than territories that got admitted ahead of it. On paper, the case was there. Many historians point to a harder explanation. A big share of the delay, they argue, came from hostility in Congress toward New Mexico's population, a majority that was Spanish-speaking and Catholic in an era when many lawmakers in Washington viewed both of those things with deep suspicion. The territory looked and sounded different from the America those men imagined, and so the door kept staying shut. Now, to be fair, this is a debate among scholars, not a settled verdict, and the honest version includes the other factors. Some historians emphasize that New Mexico had a low population spread thinly across a huge area, an underdeveloped economy for much of the period, and organized opposition from mining and railroad interests who didn't want the higher taxes that statehood might bring. All of that was real and it all played a part. But strip it down and the pattern is hard to ignore. The wait wasn't really about whether New Mexico could govern itself. It was, in large part, about who New Mexicans were. And here's where the whole story flips upside down. Because what that excluded population did next is the last thing anyone in 1900 would have predicted. The state once judged unfit to govern itself has become a national leader in exactly the kind of government it was denied. New Mexico now has the highest share of Hispanic lawmakers of any legislature in the entire United States. The very population that Congress used as a reason to keep the door locked is now the population that runs the place. It goes further than the legislature. New Mexico elected 3 consecutive Hispanic governors, a first in American history in Wild, and at one point that included a Republican Latina governor leading a state that reliably votes Democratic, which cuts straight across the neat political categories most people carry around in their heads. Sit with the full arc of that. The exact trait that was used to deny statehood a Hispanic Spanish-speaking identity became the defining strength of the state's politics. The thing held up as a weakness turned into the source of the power. That is the inversion in its purest form. It took a century, but the ground that was shut out ended up on top. And with that, we can finally head back to the city itself, where one last reversal is waiting, and it's the most physical one of all. Here's what Sunbelt cities do. They sprawl. Phoenix, Las Vegas, Houston, Dallas. They spread outward across flat open land in every direction, swallowing desert and farmland, adding suburb after suburb with almost nothing to stop them. Endless room is basically the defining feature of the American Sunbelt city. Albuquerque can't do it, and the reason ties every thread of this story together. Look at what surrounds the city. To the east, the Sandia Mountains rise up like a wall. Through the middle runs the Rio Grande, with its floodplain hemming things in. To the west stand the volcanic cliffs, those black lava escarpments left by the young volcanoes of the rift. And wrapping around much of the rest is land the city simply cannot build on. Military land tied to Kirtland and Sandia, and the sovereign lands of Native American pueblos, whose presence here, remember, predates the city by centuries. Add it all up and Albuquerque is boxed in on every single side. Mountains, river, lava, federal land, tribal land, a complete ring. So one of the major cities of the American Sunbelt, in a region defined by unlimited outward sprawl, has essentially hit its physical growth ceiling. It's fenced in by the exact same violent, torn-apart geography that built it in the first place. The rift gave the city its dramatic setting, and then closed the walls around it. So let's snap the whole contradiction stack shut. The rain falls on the wrong side of the mountains. The ground the city stands on is collapsing while the peaks beside it rise. The town abandoned its own birthplace to chase a railroad. It was refounded decades later by a bomb. It's the biggest city in its state and holds none of the power. It sits inside the state that waited longest in American history to be let into the country, kept out largely for who its people were. And that same population now leads the most Hispanic government in the nation. And after all of that, this Sunbelt city in the land of endless sprawl has run out of room to grow. Line those up next to a normal American city and every single one points the wrong way. That's the thing about Albuquerque. It isn't just unusual, a quirky town with a few odd facts. It is, feature by feature, from the bedrock 3 miles down to the politics of the whole state, the systematic opposite of the American city. Where other cities followed the rules of geography and history, Albuquerque did the reverse at nearly every step, and somehow it worked. That's what a city built inside a crack in the continent looks like. If you want to see more places where the land quietly decided everything, there's a video waiting for you right on screen. And if you'd like to keep exploring how geography shapes the country, go ahead and subscribe.